Hey up, welcome and welcome back, and I hope this finds you well. Now, it's fair to say that that last video I uploaded regarding the apparent banning of motorcycles from the Whitby railway station and therefore the Whistle Stop Cafe has attracted a huge amount of attention and to date several hundred comments, the vast majority of which have expressed disbelief and disgust at what appears for all the world to be an act of outright discrimination against the motorcycling community. Thank you so much to everybody who took the time to post a comment. I really do appreciate it, and I'm sure you'll understand that much as I would want to, I can't respond individually to all of them. But it did get me to thinking about the origins of this kind of draconian, authoritarian decision making, and the extent to which it is rooted in unfounded prejudice and a perception outside of motorcycling circles of bikers as somehow a rebellious group hell-bent on disrupting the natural order of things. So where do these notions come from then? Well, so many of the comments made reference to experiences relating to bikers being excluded from a number of places of resorts, pubs, shops, cafes, etc. in the 1970s and 80s, and also references to being required to remove helmets in places like filling stations. I've certainly got personal experience of that one, so I did start to wonder why such unreasonable characterisations of motorcyclists existed in the numbers that they apparently did then, and do now. And to what extent, if any, the recent events with the Whistle Stop Cafe and Whitby railway station are a legacy reaching back many decades. In the years following the end of World War II, Britain entered a recovery phase, and austere living standards, including food rationing, continued into the 1950s. Personal motorised transport was very much the exception during those early years, but by the late 50s and into the 60s the country began to recover some of its prosperity, and many a young man, and they were almost all men, found themselves not only in steady, secure, relatively well-paid employment, but with that access to loans and hire purchase plans for all manner of things, including motorcycles. It was without doubt an era of boom and growth for the mainly British motorcycle manufacturers, and out of this newfound prosperity emerged a culture which had not previously been associated with the often gentlemanly nature of pre-war motorcycle riders. At some point, and it's hard to say exactly when, motorcycle riders became bikers. A new identity began to emerge and form around mainly young men who found that motorcycle ownership represented not only the freedom offered by affordable motorised transport, but an emancipation following the preceding years of social stasis and drag. As this new identity evolved and expanded, it sprouted offshoot groups in the form of motorcycle clubs and clans. We've all heard of these, maybe even been a part of them. From all of this emerged a divergent path which captured the imaginations of the more rebellious and, shall we say, capricious spirits of some young and not so young riders alike. Ton-up boys, patch clubs, and the cultural split which gave us the mods and the rockers all gave rise to a level of cultural polarisation within the ranks of the riders of two-wheeled motorised machines. As with many culturally binary situations, the differences eventually became rivalries, and given the often rebellious nature of the young men on both sides, rivalries inevitably began to find expression in conflict. By the mid-60s, large-scale brawls between mods and rockers took place on the beaches and seafronts of a number of British coastal towns, frequently over extended bank holiday weekends. The highest profile of these took place along the south coast, but they also erupted in other coastal towns, such as Scarborough and, yes, Whitby. History has largely shown that these events were deliberately overhyped by a right-wing print media determined to sow in the minds of the broader public that these unruly young bike-riding delinquents, as they would have it, represented a threat to the very fabric of law, order and stability in the country. This media strategy, one still in use today actually, was a clear attempt to overly demonise one element of society, the better to deflect attention from the other societal ills of the day, such as inequality and racism. By creating the illusion of a readily identifiable enemy of the state, the broader population is thereby afforded a repository in which to dump its feelings of general dissatisfaction with many other aspects of life. Subsequent research in later years into the mods and rockers phenomenon led to a broad conclusion that these seafront battles were on the whole no worse than the average, well-established pre- and post-football match knock. Out of this research emerged a term with which we are all too familiar today: moral panic, a distorted fear of and contempt for anything which presents itself as being outside of a perceived societal norm. Looking back, I'm not sure whether the mods were followers of soul and ska who happened to ride scooters, or committed scooter fans who happened to like soul and ska. Similarly, whether rockers were followers of rock and roll and R&B who happened to ride motorbikes, or committed motorbike fans who happened to like rock and roll and R&B. And amidst all the fashions of Brando leather jackets, tall boots and pompadour hairstyles, or sharp suits, parkas, winkle pickers and Caesar cuts, we can, without being too unkind, recognise that these young men were less rebel without a cause and more rebel without a clue. The era of the mod and the rocker came to an end as quickly as it came into being. Youth culture moved on to find expression in other ways, but the legacy association of motorcyclists with rebellion and disorder remained within a large swathe of society right up into the 1980s, which explains to some degree the exclusionary nature of some establishments when it came to bikers. For much of the older adult population in the 80s, the era of the mod and rocker conflicts were within living memory, and I'm convinced that on some subconscious level, a young man walking into a pub in the 1980s, leather-clad, helmet in hand, might be viewed by some as the cultural spawn of Hell's Angels, Satan's Slaves, or any other patch club spelling trouble in capital letters. Moral panic. It may also be that a further pejorative stereotype of the 80s, the Barishim wannabes ripping through the country lanes in groups, wearing colourful logoed leathers and riding high-performance, high-volume Japanese sports bikes, further cemented pre-existing prejudices in the minds of some. More moral panic. All of which brings us, in a sense, full circle. As I said at the beginning, pre- and immediate post-war motorcyclists had a certain gentlemanly association. T.E. Lawrence on a Bruff Superior and all of that. Today, in many respects, we are sort of back to that image, particularly given the average age of today's riders. But I'm willing to bet that there are still some people kicking about who harbour those earlier misapprehensions and continue to regard bikers as a form of social pest or vermin to be controlled, constrained, regulated, discouraged and marginalised. Now, I'm not asserting for one moment that such motives are behind the decisions in Whitby, but they are certainly consistent with the approach. Today, much of the hardwired prejudices relating to the motorcycling community are deliberately expressed in terms of the dangers and nuisances unfairly attributed to us, as if car drivers never represented a danger or a nuisance. There is a supreme irony in the fact that some car drivers critique motorcycling as a dangerous pursuit resulting in too much injury and death, when so much of that injury and death is as a direct result of irresponsible or substandard car driving. More moral panic. It's still not clear what the precise origins of the Whitby ban are, whether they lie within Network Rail or Northern Rail, or whether the move was a collaborative one. Time may well tell. But I wouldn't be at all surprised if this sudden move, after so many years of an established and reasonably ordered state of affairs, is the direct result of a complaint from a prejudiced, indignant, yet probably influential individual with the ear of some senior faces in the rail industry. If this is indeed the case, then we must ask ourselves whether in fact we do live in a so-called age of enlightenment. An age where enmities and grievances are fully explored and reasoned to before arriving at any conclusion or imposition of restrictions. An age when the needs and expectations of all involved parties are taken into account, deliberated upon, and a reasonable compromise arrived at. This has not happened in the case of Whitby Station and the Whistle Stop Cafe. Why is that? We seem to be living in a time where so many of us have been conditioned, often by exploitative tabloid media, to demonise certain groups, to create a notional enemy so that we have somewhere to park all of our grievances. It's the easy way out in an often dysfunctional world, where the narrative is more and more one of division and suspicion. A world where to be in any way perceived outside of the prevailing order is to be vilified, discriminated against, and excluded. That's where we are, and we need to wake up.
Re